Welcome to the Problem Properties podcast. I am your host, Catherine Veer, and every week we delve into the problems that properties have that are slightly less visible than the ordinary. So here we investigate any psychic activity that may be going on, any emotional imprints from previous, or it might be that you have a property that cannot sell for love nor money nor any amount of refurbishing that you're doing. Whatever your problem is with your property, we look into and on the more intuitive levels about what is going on and finding out the logical causes and being able to shift them for you. Hello and welcome to the Problem Properties podcast. I am your host, Catherine Veer, and today I'm going to talk to you about the differences between personal, intergenerational, and property trauma and why it matters. This episode is aimed at trauma specialists, trauma therapists, experts, people who are studying trauma, and people who are interested in trauma and knowing more about the different types of trauma. I want to offer you a really inclusive approach to trauma and the wider healing journey by expanding our understanding and awareness into some of the lesser talked about root causes of trauma and how important it is to include these for our clients and our own personal healing journeys. So with all my healing work with energy, I always start with the three principles of safety, wisdom, and wonder. You need to be in or to create a safe environment so that your nervous system can come off this high alert. And so safety is always key to establish before doing any exploration into trauma work. So just want to invite you now, listening to the podcast, to take a breath and to come home into your body to see if you can feel that safety or invite that safety in. The second principle is wisdom. And wisdom is opening to not just what's going on in our head and not just everything we've known before, but a willingness to step into the unknown, a willingness to experience more and to allow more of the unconscious, invisible messages and information to come up from our bodies, from the quantum field, and from our histories, and from the environment that we are in. There is so much wisdom that is hidden, and it can start to come through once we feel safe in our bodies and in our hearts. So wisdom is the second principle, and wonder is the third principle, because once you understand more about trauma and identifying the root causes of trauma and understanding that it can come from so many more places than just our own historical personal past, that is so empowering and liberating and freeing, because once that wisdom comes through and that knowledge, and then we're able to shift all of those energies and transmute them into life enhancing energies that are really going to hold us in the highest possible health, productivity, motivation, are really going to enhance our relationships, particularly with ourselves, but also with other people, and exponentially improve our health and wellness, then it's really a phenomenal excitement that can start to build within us. And that is where the wonder comes in. Because once we realize that we have the power to transmute disruptive historical energies around us that are holding us back, that are draining us, that are affecting us adversely, and we start to do that work of intentionally bringing in the more positive, life-enhancing energies, that is when our lives start to be full of wonder
and grace. And we can think our own thoughts, we can have our own feelings, we can have life experiences that are expanding us, that are inclusive of all the different parts of us. And that is where the wonder comes in. So the three principles I work with are safety, which underpins and is the foundation of everything, which leads to wisdom, because once we feel safe and we can drop into our intuition, drop into these other invisible areas where that wisdom lies, then we can expand and we can explore, we can understand how close we are to all these reservoirs of wisdom that we can tap into. And once we tap into that wisdom, that's where the wonder comes through. It's like, oh my goodness, all of this stuff was here. I just didn't know how to reach it. I just thought I had to suffer. I did not know what was available to me, what was so close to me. That is when life becomes full of wonder. So I'm not going to get too far ahead of myself, but I wanted to introduce you to those three basic underlying principles of working with trauma and what is possible when you are willing to do that deep work with trauma. So when you set off on a healing journey, trauma is often one of the first things that you encounter. And we understand so much more about personal trauma. So many people are talking about it now, training in it, working in it. And there are some phenomenal modalities and practices that we can use and work with other people to be able to identify and shift those personal trauma patterns. Then we go on to understanding about how intergenerational and ancestral trauma that have nothing to do with us. It was just simply the family that we were born in is affecting our behavior, our experiences, our feelings, and our thoughts. But there's often a big piece of the trauma puzzle here that is missed out, and that is the part about property trauma. And that is the reason I felt so passionately about starting this podcast in the first place, because having worked on my own personal and intergenerational and ancestral trauma for over 40 years, and being in the very honored position of having assisted many clients to find the root causes and release them and clear them, both personal, intergenerational, ancestral, and past life, I realized myself that there was this big piece missing. Because once you work on your own trauma and you've worked on the intergenerational trauma and you've worked on the past life trauma, what happens when you go home? What happens if there is trauma trapped in your house, hidden trauma that you can feel that is affecting you, that you're aware of, but you simply don't know how to shift? So you might just be suffering an awful lot of symptoms from that. Because if you do all of that amazing trauma clearing work, but you're living in an environment that is so full of a kind of energetic fog, of disruptive energies from the past, then you can only move forward so slowly. So I want to talk to you about this missing piece about property trauma, why it matters, and where it interacts with and fits in with the whole trauma picture. So I'm going to give you some definitions around these different types of trauma and a few examples. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why it's important, why it matters that we take on board property trauma when we are trying to help our clients, when we are trying to assist ourselves on our own healing journeys. So it's really important not just to focus on one aspect of trauma. If we want to clear trauma, if we want to be truly free, if we want to be able to have our own thoughts, our own feelings, and live in a self-sovereign, emboldened way, we need to take a more holistic approach to trauma healing, which includes ancestral trauma, includes past life trauma, and also includes property trauma. And I have done the work with people on personal trauma, on energy field trauma, on past life trauma, ancestral and intergenerational trauma. And it's really important to know where each aspect of trauma actually comes from. We need to go into the root causes of trauma. And if we're intuitive, which so many of us are, this intuitive skill of finding these root causes can be developed, can become more sensitive, so that we can help our clients and ourselves to define and diagnose and detect exactly where the trauma comes from. Is this a past life trauma? Is this an ancestral trauma? Is it a personal trauma? Is it something that happened to us? Or is it something that's happening in the property ever since we moved in? If something has happened in our properties, either to us ourselves in our own life events and relationships of loss or grief or heartbreak or separation, or it's happened to people who lived in our homes, in our lands or neighboring houses in the past before we moved into this house, that grief or loss of somebody may be causing a heaviness and an emotional burden that is still being held by our property, by our homes. We don't even realize that that is what we are living in. That could be affecting our own thoughts, our own relationships, and our health unconsciously and invisibly, impacting on our day-to-day living in the most insidious kinds of ways. So personal trauma is trauma that comes from direct life experiences such as abuse, neglect, or loss, and there's many different things that can cause personal trauma. It's included but not limited to neglect, accidents, emergency situations. It could be witnessing violence, losing a loved one, and the impact on our mental health, our emotional health, can cause anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts, really serious health conditions, a broad spectrum of symptoms, PTSD, and just ways in which our life ends up feeling very limited. Can come any person, any time, any life event that has left an indelible mark, a scar that has changed us, changed our behavior, that has been a shock into our nervous system and then creates all sorts of ongoing impacts and re-triggerings as we move through life and have other experiences which are completely different, but then re-trigger the horror, the pain, the suffering of that original trauma until we clear it. It's incredibly important to address our personal trauma as part of an overall healing process. But that's not enough in itself. We also need to address intergenerational trauma, which is trauma that has been passed down through the family, through the DNA, through the subconscious mind and patterning. That trauma has been passed down through generations, through things that happened, has affected behavior, has affected thinking, feeling, acting, so many ways, and can affect your capacity to be motivated, your capacity to be successful, capacity to be able to live your own life rather than living your life through other people. So many generations ago, the impact, the echoes are still being felt. Intergenerational trauma may have happened one or more generations ago, an impact of an event, of a situation, of a family breakdown, a war, a famine, a flood, some terrible event that happened in somebody's life and affected them, and the echoes are still being felt right the way through the generations. And that is where you end up with a family where everybody has a problem with their hips or their knees, or has a bad back, or is more prone to getting a particular type of cancer, or is more prone to not feeling good enough or not being able to succeed in business. There are so many ways in which ancestral trauma can show up. Could be just a lingering sadness, existential issues, mental health issues, so many things. But they are nothing to do with us. They are simply to do with the family that we were born into. And we receive those messages, the impact of those traumatic events that happen to other people as if they've happened to us. And again, we often blame ourselves for those kinds of traumas. We often think if we look deep within ourselves, that's where they come from. And it's a similar thing with past life trauma, where actually it has nothing to do with us on that level. It has everything to do with something that happened to somebody else, either to that other part of us in a previous or parallel life, or that happened to a member of our ancestors. and their family issues. So it's very important to be able to distinguish at this point whether it's something that we can deal with ourselves as a personal trauma, or whether it's something that's just unconsciously needs to surface so that we can understand where it comes from. We can understand it's not ours, then it's so much easier to shift. And another really important aspect of intergenerational trauma, and one that I have embraced with both arms, is this idea that if I am able to clear this intergenerational trauma, I'm not going to pass it on to my family, to my partner, to my friends, to my clients, to everybody I meet. I am not going to pass that on. The buck stops here. And if one person in a family can step up and say, I will be the person who will shift all this intergenerational trauma for everybody, for all time. And to do that work is very, very powerful. And it's very, very important. It's amazing work to be able to do. But without doing it, these patterns just keep getting passed on and on and on. And they will go on forever until somebody stands up and says, I am going to start shifting all of this stuff. Intergenerational trauma can be dysfunction, addiction, abuse. It can change your beliefs, your behaviors, your emotional responses in lots and lots of unconscious ways, physically causing similar symptoms, health conditions to occur right the way across the family. So you find cousins all get divorced, you find cousins who have a problem with eating, not being able to go to a certain place, or having suicidal tendencies. There are so many things like that that can go on. And we can, of course, set up these intergenerational patterns ourselves for future generations if we don't do our own healing work. That's really something to become aware of. So intuition is very, very helpful here to try and identify the root cause of the trauma. Ask where it happened, what decisions were made at that time, and what is the impact of those decisions having on every single member of the family consciously and more unconsciously ever since. And so intergenerational trauma can shape us and our behaviors and our lives and limit us and take away our freedom in so many ways. So we need to look at inherited patterns of trauma and release those at the root cause level energetically, so that not only can you be freed, but you can say, the buck stops here. I am free. Everyone I meet will be free. I'm not going to pass on this energy anymore. It stops here. And that's how I feel with my family. I feel like with my understanding of this type of trauma and the family patterns that are associated with it, that I can identify and work with them, which I've done relentlessly for decades now. And I'm releasing myself. I'm not passing those on to my daughter, to my friends, to my clients, to the people I meet, because they have been cleared. So it's incredibly important to look at and clear intergenerational trauma. Past life trauma is also important to look at. Sometimes in past lives, parallel lives, things have happened to us. Decisions we've made in a really crisis situation where we've been dying or we've been killed in a horrible way. We make some decision. And the decision we make affects every single life afterwards. It could be something like, I'm never going to trust anyone again. I'm never going to get married again. I'm never going to take a risk again. I'm never going to be a girl again. I'm always going to be a boy because this is what happens to girls. There's all sorts of decisions that we make in past lives that can have an impact. But unless we identify them and clear them, we're missing a very important piece of this healing puzzle for ourselves. And once we've done this work, we need to look at property trauma. Property trauma is associated with a specific location or an environment. This can be a work environment, a home environment, and it often shows up in a house that we can't sell. House that we walk through the door, all our energy gets drained out of us. Examples of this are like during COVID, and people suddenly had to work at home and realize that they didn't have the same motivation. They couldn't work in the same way that they could in the office environment, or they could work in their home environments in a more productive way than they could in their office environments. And they started to question, why is this? Why is the energy around me so different? Because I'm the same person, but if I'm in a different environment, why is it that my energy is different? My health is different. My well-being is different. My capacity to be productive and to perform is different. All these differences depend on where we are. And if you go out of the door and you suddenly feel liberated, perhaps that's because there is some hidden trauma in your property that you need to investigate. When you're living in a property that has property trauma, which most properties do, and there has been a lot of violence in the past or in the neighborhood, maybe a bomb has been dropped, there's been a war, or you're living on sacred land that peoples in the past regarded as sacred, and they see you as making an intrusion, an invasion onto sacred land. And so they're unhappy. So you've stirred up unhappy spirits, unhappy feelings from other beings from the past without realizing it, because you just moved into your property. And it could be that when the property was built, there were lots of issues around the architect or around the workers not being paid correctly, not being honoured, lots of issues over the planning process, or the intention for the home was different. I had one situation I worked on when I was looking at an apartment block in Cyprus, in Limassol, and I saw in spirit there was a parallel home invisibly there, which was the other intention of what that property should be. So I discovered that it's not just parallel lives, but also parallel homes that you can have, parallel buildings, if there is a split or a disagreement about how that property should be built or designed, where so many wires can get crossed and remain unresolved. So there's all sorts of problems that can emerge around the planning, around the building, around the conditions of the workers, around who got paid, who got forced out, shortcuts that were made, additions that were made that the home hasn't accepted. There are just so many possibilities for why you can't sell properties, why you can't buy properties, why you go into a property and you suddenly get a shudder, you feel cold, you get goosebumps. People feel all sorts of things, the unhappiness that's there. You can feel the anger that's being held there somehow. There's so much that we are picking up on, but we don't really know what it is. We don't really know how to deal with it. We might become aware of it. But when we're trying to buy and sell properties, if you've done the marketing, you've changed the estate agent, you've done all the refurbishment, you've repainted the walls, and you've done everything you possibly can, staging, advertising in more places, and maybe you've even put some sage around the place and it's still not selling, then it's a time to look into emotional attachments, either yours or the previous owners. Perhaps they've been forced out, or they had trauma whilst they were living there, and their trauma and the emotional imprints of that need to be cleared. And once they're cleared and you bring in the intention for the right people to buy the property, then it can sell really, really easily. So every home has emotional imprints from the past and from us, because all the time we're putting either our conscious or our unconscious intentions and feelings into our environment. We're layering them in, if you like layers of paint on the wall. That's happening all the time, all the time. And people like me can go into a property and can read and see and feel those layers and can identify exactly what they are. So the ones that are more unsettling, the ones that are more disruptive or destructive, they can be brought into conscious awareness, transformed, released, and then once they're cleared, you can bring in the life-enhancing energies, which can really help to move people forward. Every home has emotional imprints from the current owners, from past owners, things that maybe happened on the land before. And it's really, really important to find out what those things are and to be able to find the root causes of those property traumas. Are they, for example, earthbound souls who got stuck for some reason, got lost in time because they felt they didn't matter? Because I had one of those recently who felt that she didn't deserve to go to heaven. So she was just kind of hiding out in some kind of energetic pocket on earth until she was discovered that she was there and we heard her story. And we were able to validate her and see her and give her that permission to be able to be known and seen and move on into the light. And I had another chap who was trapped in somebody's flat in their bedroom because he felt he didn't matter. And he'd worked all his life on the roads, and he talked to us about how he was out in all weathers. He hated his job. It was really dangerous. People were getting killed on the roads and having serious health conditions. And he never found a way out of his job, but he just always hated it. And we were listening to his story. We were able to validate him and who he was and tell him his life did matter and show him some of the ways that his life had mattered. And a really important thing I was able to say to him was, thank you for doing those roads. Because you worked on those roads, I am able to go on holiday, to go on retreat, to go in emergency situations to find my family members or friends. I'm able to visit, I'm able to do things with my work because I'm safe on the roads, because of those roads that you worked on. I am able to have so much more freedom to be able to move around, to travel, to do the things that I need to do on this work. So I thanked him. And he had no idea at all. He'd made no connection whatsoever between the work that he'd done and how that had impacted other people's lives, like mine. And I had another earthbound soul recently who was stuck because the story he told me was that he had pushed his mother down the stairs and crippled her. And he felt so guilty about that because he had never admitted it in his lifetime. And he'd held onto the guilt of that, and no one had ever worked it out. And then the second double whammy was that he didn't want to move on and go to heaven because he didn't want to have to face his mother, because his mother knew what he'd done and he felt so guilty. And that was why he was stuck. So every earthbound soul has a story about why they're stuck, why they're afraid of moving on, why they don't realize that they can move on. And it's really important to listen to that story, to validate them, to give them a bigger picture, and to be able to help them to move on. So you can have these earthbound souls who are there and stuck, but they don't want to be there. So they're causing havoc, they're causing issues. And so it's not kind to let them stay there. If they're causing havoc in your life, they're trying to get your attention because they want to be free. So it's really important to set them free so that they're no longer stuck in your home, in your property, and they're not going to be there for anybody else that moves into your property after you leave. So when you think about the past, and it's only in the recent past that we've come to terms with understanding how important the emotional aspect of life is. And that is to honor our feelings, to feel them, to accept them, to express them in positive ways and safe ways. But in the past generations have repressed feelings or acted out of them in angry, abusive ways, because they haven't had this understanding about emotional intelligence and emotional health, and they did not have the practices or the structures or the processes to be able to express their emotions well. So there's all of that, the emotional impact of all of that is still resonating in homes and on the land. And it can be your property, and it can be leaking in from properties on either side. I've had situations of that happening, or you might be under psychic attack from someone across the street. I've experienced all these things in my work. And what's important again is to find the root causes of where these specific things come from. And if you're experiencing and bringing them into conscious awareness, that is an incredible first step towards being able to clear them, transmute them, heal them, cleanse them, so that homes can be free, liberated spaces. Our environments can support us. They can champion us with intention. We can bring in powerful, intentional, life-enhancing energies that we can live within, which help us with all the healing work that we do on our healing journeys. If we are not addressing property trauma, we are missing a really significant piece of the trauma puzzle. So there's lots of different ways in which personal trauma and property trauma can start to impact and impinge and influence each other and get entangled in all these kinds of ways. So again, it's very important to be able to untangle those things. So I want you to know that all these energies can be cleared because they are energy, and energy doesn't go anywhere, but it can be transmuted. And I like to work collaboratively with people to clear these layers and levels of trauma. There are safe ways that we can really, really clear these things. Personal trauma, the intergenerational trauma, the past life trauma, and the property trauma, because they're all pieces of the puzzle, and we need to take on board the whole full spectrum. So we address all aspects of trauma so that people can live their own lives in a free way and fulfill their mission without being affected by these kinds of things. Each person's healing journey is completely unique, but it's very important for us to do that root cause detective healing work, to be able to look at exactly where a specific issue is coming from, which might be one place, and it might be a more complex trauma picture of coming from many different areas. There are these key differences between personal, intergenerational, and property trauma. And I hope I've been able to start to show you some of those differences and how they can impact on each other, because most of trauma is hidden. We just experience it in our bodies, in our lives, in our experiences. But until we stop to reflect and do the inner work to find out where it's really coming from, we're just simply stuck in some kind of trauma repetitive cycle. So I would like to encourage you to explore trauma with curiosity and with compassion and with safety and with wisdom and wonder. And if you're new to property trauma and you feel this could be a significant aspect in your work, I invite you to have a conversation with me, invite me to come and speak to some of your clients. My details are below. And if you have a property that you know has property trauma within it, or you would like to investigate the different layers and levels of property trauma that it is holding, I invite you again to contact me. I can have a conversation with you and tell you some of what's going on there. That's it for me for today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Problem Properties podcast. I have been your host, Catherine Veer, and I look forward to speaking to you very soon.